he was carried captive to Babylon during the reign of Jehoiakim. He had three companions with him because of their special qualifications, and they were selected for the king's service. And his name was Daniel. Daniel was a member of Jewish nobility. There is a marked resemblance between Daniel and his career and the career of Joseph if you study their lives. Both were taken captive in their youth, and both were models of obedience and faithfulness. Both were uniquely persecuted and unjustly persecuted. Their hardships, however, were stepping stones to honor. So I want to read just a little bit from Daniel. I'd really like to read the entire chapter. I may not, but in Daniel, beginning with the first chapter and the first verse. Daniel 1:1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel he gave the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord, the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. I think I'll stop there. Maybe it'll make you curious enough to read the rest of it this week, okay? We'll talk through it anyway. When we look at Daniel, we see a standard bearer. We see a man of uncompromised faith. We see a God-centered hero, I think, a statesman and a prophet, ultimately. As we observe the world around us, we're exposed to, I would say, a Heinz 57 variety of humanity. Some perhaps best described by the psalmist in Psalm 10:4, where he says, "God is in none of his thoughts." Those who are too proud to seek God. We're surrounded by people like that. Secondly, there's another group. I call them moral man or moral woman. They're decent people. They're respectful. They're good employees, good employers, good neighbors. But they don't have a personal walk with God. In fact, they don't know much about God, and they're really not terribly interested. Then there's a third group of people that the prophet refers to in Isaiah 26:3 with these words: "You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast or stayed, because he trusts in you." This is the good description of Daniel. A man whose mind was stayed on God, I suppose probably would be rated as one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. In verse 8 it says Daniel had resolve. He had determination. He was going to do the right thing no matter what. He made a decision. He is, by the way, a prisoner of war. We might as well say that. He was to be re-educated, learn the language, study the literature, learn to think like a Babylonian, eat the royal food. In other words, it's what is being called woke currently. Re-education, cancel culture. His culture. But Daniel resolved. Now, why does Daniel refuse to eat the food provided by the king. I mean, to my knowledge, there was no prohibition in the Hebrew laws that they couldn't have, for example, the meat or the wine, the prohibition from eating meat, unless, of course, it wasn't bled properly or it was been used as a sacrifice to idols. There was really no prohibition. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's efforts. I don't blame him. I would be doing the same thing if I was Nebuchadnezzar, but to make Daniel one of them, to get the captives to conform and make them useful in his kingdom. But Daniel draws a line in the sand, and that's something we all have to do. I hope I don't want us to all have to do it, but we all have to do it. So if we face that, we want to be a Daniel. How is your resolve in the face of your surroundings? Just ask you that. In a world that is becoming more pagan by the minute, literally is reverting back to paganism. How's your resolve? How's your faith? Let's look at some of the areas where Daniel had resolve and where we also might need to have resolve. The first word that I would use would be isolation. Daniel was from a family of Jewish nobility. He was captured in Jerusalem, was taken to Babylon, where he would be isolated from the influences of his family. And he would be isolated from his own people, not just the family, and certainly from his religion. At that time in the East, there were at least two prominent worldviews. One is was called an ancient Near East worldview, the belief in many gods. If you use a pie graph, like we might have used when we were in college, you use a pie graph and you cut the pie in 3 slices, which gives you a pretty good piece of pie, by the way, if you would do that always. One piece is identified as nature, one humanity, and one gods, plural. And on the outside of it and surrounding that pie is magic and astrology and fortune-telling and all of that that's pointing in. That's polytheism, belief in more than one God, belief in many gods. The other worldview, monotheistic, belief in one God, you cut the pie in half. That's even better. I mean, I can eat a half a pie anytime. Maybe. I can try. So you cut the pie in half, 2 pieces. One is nature, one is humanity. But outside, pointing in, is a transcendent God. Transcendent God, overseeing all of that. No magic here, but just a supernatural, holy God, one God. By the way, God doesn't say don't touch magic because it doesn't work. God said don't touch magic. Magic, real magic, not magician magic, not sleight of hand, not even a mental insight or a sixth sense, but real magic is evil. We'll see more and more of it. I used to live near Camp Chesterfield. If you want to see a lot of fakes, not any real magic, but some that's evil, it's like these church camps that I go to, only that's all it is. It's near Anderson, Indiana. It's called Camp Chesterfield. And so you're dealing then with angels of darkness, the seance, occult, and sorcery. So Daniel has been forcibly taken from a biblical worldview to a worldview where they worship many gods. And the more gods they can accumulate, the better off they are. You know, we say, no, you only serve one God. But if they could capture another god of another country, they take it, and they have lots of gods. So he's isolated. He's educated. His name is changed, and God says, Daniel, don't become a victim to indoctrination, his personal cancel culture. And Daniel resolved to maintain his identity. Now, there's an attempt by the world to isolate us today, I think more than I've ever seen before, although it certainly happened in other countries, and some of them are still, the change is still in effect. There's a decline in religious activity. I think the decline just started in the early 60s when the Supreme Court removed prayer from public schools. It leveled a bit in the 70s all the way up to the early 90s, but now it's in free fall as far as people who are Christians and church attenders. If woke and the left are able to succeed in their efforts, the church will be placed more and more in a position of isolation. In fact, the next election, I think, will be the last real election in this country unless something changes. So isolation is number one. Number two, Daniel faced indoctrination. Verse 4, Daniel was taught the language and the literature and the history of the Babylonians. It is both harmless and wise to study a foreign language. In fact, Rob Cole did a lot of translating when he was in the service. He knew several languages. But the aim of this course in Chaldean was not merely academic. It was an attempt to indoctrinate and to influence his mind to thinking like a Babylonian. In 1970, I was introduced to a different kind of indoctrination, and some of you were too. I was provided some lovely apparel from a fashion center, included green shirts, green socks, green caps, 4 pair of green pants that didn't fit, none of them fit, black fashion boots, and an M16. And the government's attempt to modify my civilian mindset to a military mindset. I don't know if they accomplished that. I'm not sure that they did in their attempt, but I did graduate AIT as the honor graduate. Christians undergo an attempt at indoctrination every day. We see it every day. We see it on television. They're not just trying to indoctrinate Christians. They're trying to indoctrinate everyone. A lot of it has to do with commercials. They want you to buy their product. Without taking time to share many examples, let me just do it with one passage. In Isaiah 5:20, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. How many things that you see around you now that you think that's wrong, but there's a whole group of people that's saying, you're wrong for saying that's wrong. We're right and you're wrong. We're calling people that are calling good evil. The question was raised to the Christian church in Lebanon not long ago. The question was raised, what is the greatest difficulty? What is the greatest hurdle that you are facing as a church in Lebanon? Well, what would they say? Wouldn't they say civil war? Wouldn't they say Hezbollah? Wouldn't they say terrorists? Wouldn't they say unrest? No. The greatest difficulty that the church in Lebanon faces is American television. American television and the indoctrination that people get from it. In fact, when my wife went overseas, she came back and said, I felt so innocent because I hadn't watched TV for so long and I saw all the garbage that was there that I hadn't seen for weeks and weeks, and I just kind of got used to it. American television. I've always believed it was. I like American television, by the way, but I don't watch much of it. I watch a few things. The rest of it is, I call it a trash compactor. But anyway, we all have one. So Daniel was placed in a position where it would be easy now. Number 3, to compromise. Compromise. In verse 5, Daniel was assigned a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Well, that's an honor. I'm a POW. What choice do I have anyway? I have to do what I'm told. Things could be worse. How often do we say, well, what choice do I have anyway? You always have a choice. When I was working my master's, we had a visiting professor from Ashland Theological Seminary. His name was Bill Arnold. The subject, he's now at Asbury, by the way, I discovered, but the subject was Daniel for an entire semester. And as we discussed Daniel's response to an indoctrination and I remember the professor asking this question. Of course, things were a bit different in those days. It's been a few years ago. He said, if your son is on a baseball team and the big game is coming up, but it gets rained out, so it wasn't on a Sunday, obviously, but they have to reschedule it for Sunday. It gets rescheduled to play on Sunday at 10 a.m. What do you do? Well, we're just the class. We're listening. He said, that's my time of worship. That's my tradition. That's my time set aside for God. He said, God and I have an agreement. It's a covenant. It's an appointment I always keep. And then I'm sure as a class we discussed, I wish I remembered what all was said, but as a class we discussed what's right and what's wrong about all of that. Now, I know that I'm stepping on toes not only in this church, but every church I ever pastored when I say this. And I will also say there will always be exceptions to almost every rule, not every rule, but there are exceptions to rules. There are things that we need to do on the Lord's Day. I understand that. But when people stay home from worship, for example, it's my 2-year-old granddaughter's birthday. Oh, really? Well, is she going to know the difference if you celebrate it in the afternoon or yesterday? That's going to keep you out of church? I've heard that many times, and I've never stayed home with my kids because you wouldn't let me. You won't let me stay home with my kids on their birthday. Or have a family in town so we cannot attend worship because we have family or friends in town. Well, how about it the way we do it at our house? We tell our guests, why don't you come and go to church with us? And you don't just have to do that. Why don't you come and go to church with us? I mean, it's only an hour. Or, if not, we'll be back in an hour. That's really tough to do, of course. Some of you miss an opportunity to influence friends and family that you may even be praying for and hoping that they'll start attending church wherever they live. If you go, I mean, and if they attend, if they come and see an example of how you worship, that may move them, or they may stay home but respect you because you're faithful to what you believe. We don't have to compromise. Those are just the little things. We compromise on so many bigger things. We don't have to compromise. We have a choice. That's a very minor example. Jonathan Edwards is arguably one of America's great scholars, and he said, free moral agents always act according to the strongest inclination they have at the moment of choice. The good life that Daniel was offered was intended to wean him away from the life to which God had called him. Prosperity and advancement will often, not always thankfully, will often seduce us to compromise. But Daniel had resolve. He obeyed God, and he was respected, and he was honored as both a prophet and a statesman, a godly example to the Babylonians and even to the people that were in charge. Because if you study his life, you know that he served 4 kings. He must have been doing a great job, served 4 kings. Daniel was put in a position of number 4, potential confusion. In verse 4, the chief official gave them new names. In the process of trying to change Daniel, we see this final effort. It's another area where Daniel has resolve. The Babylonians gave Daniel a Babylonian name. His name would be Belteshazzar. Daniel was his Hebrew name, and it meant God is my judge. Belteshazzar was his Babylonian name, God of wind and storm. The 3 Hebrew boys, which we really don't see much about right here, but we always talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach's Babylonian name was God has been gracious. His Hebrew name was Hananiah, God of the moon. Meshach, his Babylonian name is there is a God, and Mishael, the Hebrew name Babylonian name speaks of a false god. Abednego, God has helped me. Azariah, the Hebrew name, or the name for Azariah, servant of the moon god. Now, for some reason, we know Daniel by his Hebrew name. I'm not sure why that is in the Bible, but we know the 3 Hebrew boys as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Maybe it made a better song. I don't know. But that was, they were stuck with their names. But when the test of faith came, they identified with Jehovah. You remember the story of the fiery furnace. All that reminded them of their past was to be removed. As they heard their Babylonian name day after day, they might be tempted to forget their past. They might think like a Babylonian. But Daniel has resolve. In the world, but not of the world. To be in the world, but not of the world. That's what God calls us to be. Is there any confusion in your life? That's a silly question, isn't it? There's lots of confusion we all face. A prominent tool of the evil one today, economic confusion. Lots of it. Political confusion. Washington, D.C. is I think, the biggest state of confusion I have ever seen in my lifetime. Environmental confusion, who knows? It's more politics than science. Just lots and lots of confusion. What does the Bible have to say about that in 1 Corinthians 14:33? For God is not a God of confusion, but he's a God of peace. So Daniel faced some very confusing issues, but he had resolve. Christians today are faced with a flood of opposition. It's amazing how much. I mean, we don't see it here, but it's certainly on the news and in so many places. Opposition in the form of isolation, indoctrination, compromise, and confusion. And we must have resolve. And Daniel is, he's a great example for us of that. I believe that what I'm going to read you in closing, and like I said, Ed said there's some back there if you want to pick one up. Daniel, I believe, could easily adopt this as his testimony. But at best, that would be our goal and his, because as we know, we kind of liked it too. We know nobody's perfect. We always like to say that, especially when we mess up. But anyway, this is kind of an amazing little thing. I think I've read it to you before, but how soon we forget, right? I'm a part of the fellowship of the unashamed. I have Holy Spirit power. The die has been cast. I have stepped over the line. The decision has been made. I am a disciple of his. I won't look back, let up, slow down, back away, or be still. My past is redeemed. My present makes sense. My present makes sense. My future is secure. I'm finished and done with low living, sight walking, small planning, smooth knees, colorless dreams, tamed visions, mundane talking, cheap living, and dwarfed goals. I no longer need preeminence, prosperity, position, promotions, plaudits, or popularity. I don't have to be right first, tops, recognized, praised, regarded, or rewarded. I now live by faith, lean on his presence, walk by patience, lift by prayer, and labor by power. My face is set, my gait is fast, my goal is heaven, and my road is narrow, my way is rough, my companions few, my guide reliable, my mission clear. I cannot be bought, compromised, detoured, lured away, turned back, deluded, or delayed. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice, hesitate in the presence of the adversary, negotiate at the table of the enemy, ponder at the pool of popularity, or meander in the maze of mediocrity. I won't give up, shut up, let up, until I have stayed up, stored up, prayed up, paid up, preached up for the cause of Christ, for I am a disciple of Jesus. I must go till he comes, give till I drop, preach till all know, and work till he stops me. And when he comes for his own, he will have no problem recognizing me, because my banner will be clear. He's pretty clear on what he believes. Let's stand together. Thank you, Father, for what an incredible man and prophet and life we see in Daniel. And we're not in a situation as he was, but we clearly have times when we have to say yes or no, or to take a stand. So help us, Lord, to put you first. Christ, you are first and foremost in our lives, and should be the most important thing in our walk. Thank you for these moments together. Bless this congregation. As we go forth, Lord, help us to represent you well. In Christ's name.